Good morning, Boker Tov. Um, at this moment, if not for the fact that we committed for this particular shiur, I actually would have been on my way to Har Herzl. Unfortunately, there's a price to be paid in every single war. We all know that. We all understand that. The bitter price that we all paid a month ago before we entered the war was just beyond belief. And now that we are committed to a ground operation in Gaza, in a holding operation in the north, we unfortunately have sustained several losses. Every single person, soldier, civilian alike, is an entire world. And the Mishnah tells us in Masechet Sanhedrin that Bishvili Nivra Ha'olam, the world would have been created for every single individual. And that is why Kadosh Baruch Hu does not have any human being look like the next one. Every person is different. Every person is unique. And it would have been worthwhile for Kadosh Baruch Hu to create the world for each and every one of us individually. And that's why the Chazal tell us in the Mishnah that Kadosh Baruch Hu creates the world with one person, with Adam, and not with 10,000 or 10 million individuals. But somehow, when you happen to know the people involved, whether it's the person who has fallen, whether it's the family who you're acquainted with, it's extremely painful. And this is a country where, small country, and everybody knows everybody. It's almost like an oversized bungalow colony where everybody knows sometimes too much about the affairs of the next one, and sometimes a lack of privacy. But there's a lot of good to that as well, because for those who are really engaged in the suffering itself, they know that they're not alone. And there are so many people with them to support them, to join them, to empathize with them. It's very, very difficult. Each name is important, but I'm just going to name one Chayal who fell yesterday in Gaza, who I personally acquainted with the family. Yonadav Raz Levenstein, Hashem Yikom Damo. His father, Alav Shalom, was a friend of mine, Dr. Mordechai Levenstein, from my Beersheba days, someone who hailed from Toronto, came in Aliyah, moved to Yerushalayim when we did, and then moved on to Maleh Adumim. Unfortunately succumbed to illness several years ago. His son fell yesterday. His mother is the sister of my Mechutenet from Talmon, so we know the family. Some of you may know the grandparents, the Solomon family from Talbia. It's a very, very hard moment for anybody who knows anybody in the war. And it's a hard moment for all of us just to hear the news in the morning about the next set of names that unfortunately have been reported. Yet, when we talk to the families and the Chayalim, and sometimes some of these Chayalim left legacies with notes to their families about how strong we should be, it gives each and every one of us, some type of chizuk, some type of strengthening to continue, not to let go. And that's how we are as a people. One of the issues that has indeed surfaced in the last month has to do with taking responsibility. Believe me, I'm not going to utilize the few minutes that we have together to engage in a blame game. We'll leave that to the politicians, and hopefully at the end of the war. Now is not the time to engage in the issues of who's responsible for this and who is responsible for that. But to talk about the essence of responsibility, that's clearly something that I believe is part of our mandate. It's interesting that within both the political and the military worlds, there have been those who've come forth, some earlier, some later, by accepting responsibility and saying, okay, but now let's move on and win this war. And we'll deal with the responsibility issues. We'll deal with the various investigations that will take place at a later date. And I believe that that is correct. That is the proper approach. I don't believe that now is the time to call for any type of replacement of anybody in government. Now's just not the time to deal with these kinds of issues. But with regard to the question itself about the essence of responsibility, so that things should be clear in our own minds, our Rabbi Soloveitchik, many, many years ago, addressed the issue from the point of view of Sefer Breshit. You just can't get a book in the Torah that speaks of responsibility, of achrayut, than the book of Breshit. And we're going to highlight some of those issues that the Rav pointed out, and what we can learn from them. One of the issues of responsibility has to do with a leader who has to be trained to what leadership is all about. You know that Yaakov Avinu, he knew that Yosef was going to be a leader. And hence, as a youngster, Yosef is in training for leadership. And our Chachamim, our sages, have taught this to us on many, many things that have to do with Parshat Vayeshev. We know that in Parshat Vayeshev, Yosef is a youngster. He's 17 years old. And he's sold into slavery, to Egypt. And ultimately, as the Torah tells us, he actually rises to power and he becomes the vice king in Egypt and responsible for all the economics during the days of hunger in Mitzrayim in Egypt. The idea that Yaakov is training Yosef is borne out at almost the end, the climactic side of the story, where the brothers return to the land of Canaan and they reveal this great news to the father Yaakov that Od Yosef Chai, Yosef is still alive. And here for 22 years, Yaakov is living with the thought that Yosef is dead. He's been killed by a ferocious animal. And in Parshat Vayeshev, the Torah states that Yaakov feels he's going to die in mourning. There's just no way to console him. Vayima'en litnachem, vayomer ki ered al bini avel she'ola. He's going to die a mourner. And here, after 22 years, the brothers come back from Egypt and they report that Yosef is alive. And not just alive, perhaps surviving in some dungeon in Egypt. He's a leader in all of Egypt. It's very difficult for Yaakov Avinu to accept the news, except there's a clinching moment that Yaakov realizes, yeah, this is actually true. Because the Torah says that Yaakov recognizes the truth of the story when he sees the agalot asher shalach Yosef, sees the wagons that Yosef sent. Now, what's so startling about the wagons that Yosef sent? I mean, here Yaakov's being told that Yosef is a leader, and he's a political leader. He's second to the king. So, of course, he has some limousines at his disposal that he'll be able to send to Eretz Canaan to bring down the family. That's not something that should be so shocking. Except that several verses earlier, we actually told that the one who sent down the agalot, the wagons, to transport the family down to Egypt was actually Paro, the king himself, and not Yosef. So why does the Torah tell us that when Yaakov sees the wagons that Yosef sent down, Vayar et ha'agalot asher shalach Yosef, v'techi ruach Yaakov avihem. Yaakov's spirit is rejuvenated. Yaakov is convinced, finally, that Yosef is actually alive. So Rashi tells us that the word agalah is a play on words with an interesting halacha that's found in the end of Parshat Shoftim of the book of Dvarim, the section of Egla Arufa. What is Egla Arufa? Rashi tells us in Parshat Vayigash that Yaakov remembered the last lesson that he and Yosef were discussing before Yosef was sold into slavery, was abducted and sold into slavery. And that was the section of Egla Arufa. Egla Arufa is a very strange parasha, where the Torah tells us that if a dead body is found, assumably murdered, between two cities. It didn't happen in a city. It happened in the outside of the city. So the Zkenim, the elders, the leaders of the two closest cities have to engage in a type of measurement, which was the closest city to this anonymous dead body. No one has a clue who he was, and he was killed out there between cities. And they have to go through, these Zkenim, these elders have to go through a ceremony where you take a calf, an egel, and the calf is beheaded by a river. It's a very strange ceremony. And then there's a declaration by these elders that while Yadenu lo shafchu et adam hazeh, well, we didn't murder him, nevertheless, we, the leaders, are going to ask forgiveness. Kapernam lamcha Yisrael. We will ask God for forgiveness. Why? Because if something like this happened between two cities, and an anonymous person was murdered, that shows that there's some decadence in society. Something's wrong. We failed in our leadership by educating every single person to the value of life. And this is a message for leaders to understand that if something like this happened, it's very, very easy to point fingers at a variety of reasons that may have brought about the murder of this anonymous person. But you most probably wouldn't look to the elders, the dayanim, the judges, the educators, the top people who represent the spiritual life, that they should be held responsible. And yet the Torah says they do. And this was a message that Yaakov is inculcating into his son Yosef by preparing him to be a leader. Don't forget that the responsibility is on top. And this was the last lesson, say our sages, that Yaakov teaches Yosef, the message of the parasha of Egla Arufa. So when Yosef sends back the agalot, the wagons, to transport Yaakov and his family down to Egypt, the agalot become a coded message of the Egla Arufa, of that which was taught 22 years earlier by Yaakov to Yosef, the message of leadership. This is the first message. And the truth of the matter is, you have the very notion that Yaakov gives and provides Yosef with the ketonet pasim, the multicolored garment, striped garment. What was this all about? I mean, this was a garment that caused immense jealousy amongst the brothers, and ultimately that jealousy grew to the extent that they first want to perhaps kill him, but ultimately they sell him, down to Egypt and literally want to dispose of him. What was behind the Ketonet Pasim? So it had nothing to do with fashion. It had nothing to do with Yaakov giving his almost favorite son a wonderful, beautiful birthday gift at age 17. It had to do with the symbolism of what this Ketonet Pasim was all about. Yosef is being trained that as a leader, never to forget that the audience, the community at large that you are now leading, they're not robots programmed in identical ways, but rather human beings are all different. And it's almost reminiscent of what our Chachamim say in Masechet Brachot with regard to just as two faces are not identical, so too two people's opinions are not identical. And indeed, we have different opinions here, different people. And Yosef had to understand that as a leader, he has to take into consideration that the people at hand are very different and they have different points of view and different needs. And this is something rather essential for a leader to undertake. But it goes beyond that. The idea of a leader assuming responsibility for the moral climate of the people is not only evident in the Egla Arufa parsha, but there's another parsha that's rather similar in terms of the message of responsibility, and it has to do with someone who's involved in an act of homicide. So we know that there's a difference between someone who is a murderer, first degree murder, and that's called retzach in modern Hebrew. But in legal terms, somebody who's involved in homicide, which means that he didn't get up in the morning to kill somebody, but he ended up causing the death of somebody, that's called hariga. It has a different status, certainly a different status, not only in the world of law, but in the world of Torah as well. There's a difference between rotzeach b'mezid, intentional murder, and this rotzeach b'shogeg, unintentional murder. And with regard to unintentional murder, so the Torah speaks of the 6 cities, the Arei Miklat, where the person who killed somebody unintentionally, and that could be perhaps given as an example, is somebody who killed somebody in a car accident. In a car accident, the person didn't get up in the morning to kill someone, but ended up killing somebody. So it wasn't something that he planned to do, but because of some degree of negligence, he ended up killing somebody. And that person, in the days of old, would have to run to the city of refugees, of Arei Miklat. And he would have to live there for the rest of his life until the demise of the Kohen Gadol, Admot Kohen Gadol. It was very strange, because if we were dealing with somebody who deserved a punishment, and the Torah would say, all right, let him spend 10 years in the Arei Miklat, we would understand that. It would make no difference for one murderer to another murderer, not a murderer, somebody who killed inadvertently to another person who killed inadvertently. You get your 10 years, you get your 20 years, you get your 5 years, whatever it is. The Torah could have spelled it out how many years this person would be in exile, basically galut, in exile from his family for that amount of years. To a certain degree, it's being imprisoned. You know that the British in the 19th century had this great idea, a very benevolent idea, to not to have some of the prisoners that they had in prisons, but to ship them off to Australia. And figuring that in Australia, they're far away from England, and they can live their lives almost freely within the framework of living on a different continent. And here, Arei Miklat is a concept where the person is in prison, but he's not really behind bars. He can live in the context of the city, but he can't leave. But when is his license to leave? When the Kohen Gadol dies. Now, the Kohen Gadol might die the next week, or he might die 50 years later. I mean, the amount of time that this Rotzeach B'Shogeg, this person who killed inadvertently, is going to sit in the Arei Miklat, is dependent upon the longevity of the Kohen Gadol, which is rather strange. And can you imagine what the Rotzeach B'Shogeg was doing day in and day out in the Arei Miklat? He was saying, tell him that the Kohen Gadol should have a heart attack and die tomorrow, because his freedom was directly dependent upon the death of the Kohen Gadol. So the Medrash says that the mother of the Kohen Gadol would actually go to the Ir Miklat and feed the Rotzeach B'Shogeg with all kinds of goodies that he should stop davening for the death of her son. I mean, so much so. But what's really behind this idea? Until the death of the Kohen Gadol, that if there is negligence amongst the population, then somebody who is responsible for the education of the generation is actually at fault. And what does the Kohen Gadol have to do with this? So we know that the Shevet Levi was entrusted with education of the population, right? Yoru mishpatecha liYaakov v'toratcha liYisrael. And the idea that the idea that not just the Leviim, who were given their 48 cities throughout Eretz Yisrael from north to south, and they were to educate the population, but also the Kohanim people, because you have to realize Kohanim and Leviim, who had tasks at the Beit HaMikdash, were on duty in Beit HaMikdash for no more than 2 weeks a year. That's all they needed them for. There was a type of miluim, a type of reserve duty. But for 50 weeks during the year, they were the educators. And who was the top educator? No one but the Kohen Gadol. He was the Sar HaChinuch, the Minister of Education of all of Am Yisrael. And that's what is said in the book of Malachi, where he says in the 2nd chapter, Ki siftei kohen yishmeru da'at, v'torah yivakshu mipihu. Something about the lips of the Kohen, that we are to draw Torah knowledge. And there are many, many Parshanim who associate this pasuk with none other than Ahron HaKohen, who was the first Kohen Gadol. And we know that when we talk about Torah learning, we're also talking about Torah behavior. And one of the ideas of Torah behavior has to do with responsibility and guarding from negligence. When the Rambam talks about the laws of murder, for example, it's entitled Hilchot Rotzeach Ushmirat Nefesh. Here are the laws of murder or killing and prevention, guarding of life, which means guarding and preventing accidents is no less important than studying the laws of murder, because that will ultimately prevent murder. And hence, in the context of Rotzeach Ushmirat Nefesh, that's where the Rambam is going to talk about all the laws of Ir Miklat, of the person who kills inadvertently. And hence, it would be the Kohen Gadol who assumes top responsibility for any type of act of shvichut damim, of killing, even on the level of inadvertent bishogeg in society. And that's why the person who goes to the Ir Miklat will remain there until the death of the Kohen Gadol. It must be perfectly clear to all that there is this level of responsibility. But if we go back to Sefer, the book of Breshit, we have, again, a detail within the story of Yosef. So we know that Yosef is sent to the prison after the episode with the wife of Potiphar, and he meets up with the 2 ministers who are also thrown into jail, the butler, the Sar HaMashkim, and the baker, the Sar HaOfim. But they're not just butlers and bakers. The Sar HaMashkim is the minister of drinks, which means he's not a bartender in any sense of the word. He is responsible for all the wines that are going to come into the palace of Paro, and has the assigned task, an honorable task, of presenting the goblet of wine to Paro himself. That must have been an actually great honor. The butler, the baker, on the other hand, he wasn't somebody who sat there next to the oven or sat there kneading dough. And the Sar HaOfim was the kitchen manager. He was responsible for the entire operation of baking. So, we all know that there are home kitchens, and we all have our home kitchens with whatever appliances and utensils that we have. And then there are also public kitchens. So the public kitchen could be a restaurant, the public kitchen could be a school, and it could be an army base, or a hotel, whatever it is, a public kitchen. And we know that public kitchens are usually much larger than anything that we may even imagine in our own homes, with sometimes different utensils and different appliances and more sophisticated appliances and so on. And usually have a team of appropriate people working there and so on. One of the great things that I had, a great sport that I had in this country was for 16 years having to kosher kitchens in the Air Force Base near Beersheba in the town of Hatzirim, the Air Force Base called Hatzirim. It wasn't a small kitchenette. That was massive kitchens to kosher. So I say this because I assume that the kitchen in the house of Paroi was also not a kitchenette, was a massive, huge kitchen providing food for the entire palace and so on. So the Sar HaOfim, he's the kitchen manager. And the Torah tells us that the two of them, the Sar HaMashkim and Sar HaOfim, are thrown into jail because they sinned. Chat'u, they sinned. So Rashi, quoting a midrash, actually accuses us into what the great sin was, what the great sins were of the Sar HaMashkim and Sar HaOfim. So it says that with the Sar HaMashkim, as the butler was presenting the gavia, the goblet, the wine goblet, the royal goblet to the king, Paroi noticed that a fly had dropped into the wine. And, that wasn't aesthetically too pleasing, as you can imagine. And he was extremely, extremely upset, and he threw the Sar HaMashkim into jail. And what happens with the Sar HaOfim is that the Paroi takes a bite into his warm bun, lachmaniyah, and he almost cracks a tooth on a pebble that was baked into that piece of bread. And he summons the Sar HaOfim and throws him into jail as well. Now, with the Torah reports that 3 days later, Paroi is celebrating his birthday, and he takes the Sar HaMashkim and Sar HaOfim out of jail. Sar HaMashkim is restored to his position, and the Sar HaOfim, the baker, is hanged. Okay? Now this result is exactly the way Yosef interprets the dreams of the Sar HaMashkim and Sar HaOfim, and it's exactly what happens. What Rav Soloveitchik asks is, what was fundamentally different between the chet, the avera, if you may, of the Sar HaMashkim, that he's now restored to his position, and Paroi is willing to grant him full clemency, as opposed to the Sar HaOfim, who gets hanged for what he does. The idea that Paroi threw both of them into jail for a few days, that was because Paroi himself realized that he was so upset with what had happened that day, he didn't think that he would be able to proceed calmly and logically, and therefore he needed a cooling off period. He needed those 3 days. And after 3 days of a cooling off period, he was able to realize that the Sar HaMashkim was not really responsible for what happened. I mean, my gosh, the man is holding a gavia, is holding a goblet, ready to present it to Paroi, and some fly from the sky takes a dive right into the goblet of wine. You can't hold a human being responsible for the action of a fly dropping into a goblet. So while it was aesthetically very much not pleasing at the moment, but you can't hold the Sarah Mashkim responsible for that. And hence, Paroi restores the Sarah Mashkim back to his position. However, with regard to the piece of bread, the roll, the lachmaniyah, that had a little pebble in it, what has to be done here? So you may think what has to be done is we have to open up an investigation and go into the kitchen and go into ledgers of all the workers of the kitchen, who exactly was on duty when flour was being sifted that would ultimately make the dough that ultimately baked into the roll. Who's responsible? Who didn't catch the pebble from going into the dough? And we can most probably figure it out after some type of investigation and punish that particular slave or servant for his misaction, not catching the pebble. But Paroi doesn't do that. Paroi takes the manager of the kitchen, the Sarofim, and he pays royally with his hanging. He's put to death. He's executed for this. What is the lesson of the Torah? We're today towards the end of the month of Cheshvan. In about a week and a half's time, almost 2 weeks' time, will be the 4th of Kislev. It will be a week from Friday, 12 days' time, the 4th of Kislev. The 4th of Kislev doesn't mean much to most people, unless it perhaps is their birthday, or perhaps there's a yard site in the family. But there is a yard site here in Israel on the 4th of Kislev. It happened back in 1987. In 1987, there was an army base not far from Kiryat Shmona in the north of the country, very close to the Lebanese border. And a terrorist came over in a glider, in a motorized glider, known as a Galshan Avir. And he came with grenades and weapons and all that, and flew into an army base. And this terrorist went into the tents and murdered 6 Chayalim and wounded another 10. There was much investigation until finally some of the Chayalim there mowed him down. There was tremendous investigations that went on. Who was responsible for this? Was it the fellow, the Chayal at the gate of the base, who should have seen this Galshan, this glider fly by and alert immediately? Was it somebody perhaps keeping their eyes on Lebanon, who should have noticed this happening earlier in the game? Perhaps it's somebody higher in the echelons of military command, who should have perhaps known from intelligence reports that this could possibly have happened. Is it somebody who's even higher than that officer? Does it go all the way to the commander of the Northern Front? Does it go all the way to the chief of staff? Does it go all the way to the minister of defense? Does it go up to the prime minister? Who's responsible for this, what we call a michdal, for what happened on the 4th of Kislev back in 1987? Who is responsible? I remember that day. What became known as Leil HaGalshonim, the night of the Galshan, the night of the entry of this Mechabel. I remember them. And you know who ultimately took the rap? That one low-ranking soldier at the gate, known as the Shin Gimel, the Shomer Gader, the Shin Gimel. And this became known as the Tismonet HaShin Gimel, the syndrome, the Shin Gimel syndrome of pinning responsibility on the lowest in the totem pole of responsibility. Nobody in the higher levels of the army assumed responsibility. And there was a public outcry in those days, because the only one who took the rap was one soldier, and he spent a year and a half in military prison for his role in allowing the Galshan to come into the base and causing this tragic result of 6 dead and 10 wounded. Tismonet HaShin Gimel. Our Rabbi Rav Soloveitchik did not know of the story of 1987. He taught what he taught, at least in my years, in the late 60s and in the 70s, and he taught Chumash. And he taught the story of the Sarah Ofim, why the baker, why the kitchen manager paid royally. And they did not investigate down to the last slave or servant in the kitchen who was responsible for the pebble that was not siphoned out of the flour, and it makes it into the dough, which makes it into the roll that Paroi cracks a tooth on. Who was it? Not the lowest on the totem pole, but the highest ranking person who's responsible for the kitchen activities, the Sarah Ofim. This is where the responsibility lay. And hence, the Torah was teaching us here a tremendous lesson of responsibility and achrayut. And you know, this goes on to the last dimension of leadership that I'd like to mention this morning, is that a leader must necessarily encompass or personify the entire nation. We have this with Moshe Rabbeinu. He's shakul keneged kol am Yisrael. He's equivalent to the entire nation. The Rav once pointed out that when Haman Harasha, and he wants to punish Mordechai, he wants to punish Mordechai for not bowing down to him, but it's not enough to punish Mordechai. He wants to punish the entire nation that Mordechai comes from. Why? Because Mordechai is referred to as Am Mordechai, the nation of Mordechai, because Mordechai personifies the entire people. And even within the framework of the laws of monarchy, the laws of leadership, the Rambam tells us about the king of Israel. Libohu leiv kol kahal Yisrael. His heart must beat the heartbeat of the entire nation. And it's true as well for the Kohen Gadol. We mentioned Kohen Gadol earlier. Because the Kohen Gadol wore the choshen, the breastplate. And on the choshen, he had the names of all of the Shvatim, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, and so on. But we know that the Kohen Gadol also carried another 2 stones on his shoulder, on the Avnei HaEphod, where it said 6 names on one side and 6 names of the other of the tribes of Israel. So why did the Kohen Gadol carry the names twice? The answer is that on the ephod, on the 2 stones on his shoulder, he was carrying the scene of all of Am Yisrael. There was a scene once when Am Yisrael split into 6 against 6, and that was at Har Grizim and Har Eval, as the Torah tells us in Parshat Ki Tavo. So this is the message of the Kohen Gadol representing the totality of Am Yisrael. But on his heart, he had to have the Choshen Alibo, because there he represented each and every Jew, not just Reuven, who was the son of Yaakov, but every Reuven of Am Yisrael, and every Shimon of Am Yisrael, and every Levi of Am Yisrael. The Kohen Gadol represented the needs and the worries of every individual. And the Rav said that on the parsha of this week that we read yesterday, Parshat Vayera, so we had the Haftarah from Melachim Bet Perek Dalet. There we have stories about Elisha Hanavi. And they seem to be stories that have nothing to do with Klal Yisrael. There's a woman who's a widow, and she's in trouble financially, and Elisha intercedes to help her out. And then there's a story of the Isha Shunamid, who has no children. And then finally, with the blessing of Elisha, she does have a child, who then dies as a child. And Elisha was able to somehow bring about the child's resuscitation. Elisha was involved in the tzarot, in the worries, in the difficulties, in the pains, in the anguish of individual people. And you might think, this is Elisha Hanavi. This is somebody who's representing HaKadosh Baruch Hu on the big level. We call the macro. Nope. The Navi teaches us that even on the micro, on the small level, the Navi was interested in being involved in helping Jews. And the Rav said that's the connection to Parshat Vayera, which opens up with the scene of Hachnasat Orchim. It was Avraham Avinu who in his tent was open on all four doors so that he shouldn't miss a potential visitor. So much so, he shouldn't miss a visitor coming from any other direction. But the Rav was of the opinion the four doors weren't just geographic directions, but they were all different types of people. Avraham Avinu was not just interested in inviting his type of person, people who belong to his community, people who daven like him, who wear the same shtreimer like him, who wear the same kippah like him, or don't wear a kippah like him. That's not what Avraham Avinu was interested in. He wanted to invite everybody, all types of people, because that is the mark of a true leader who understands the needs of every single person, and not just deals with the larger picture. Hopefully, our country will mature in the aftermath of the great tragedy we sustained a month ago, and hopefully, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will give us all the strength to see a great momentous victory, not only on the battlefield, but more so in the congealing of Am Yisrael into one great nation that will have great leaders who will take care and pay attention not only to the larger cause and the larger needs, but also to the needs of so many individuals who are going to need help after the war in rebuilding their lives, their homes, their families. And it's going to be a tremendous challenge for Am Yisrael. But at the end of the day, Mi ka'amcha Yisrael goy echad ba'aretz. We should hear Besorot Tovot for all of us, our surroundings, and all of Klal Yisrael. Shalom.